tomorrow, sunrise tomorrow, sunrise with Jesus for eternity.
But he's my leader.
You saw in the previous videos how the identity of Apollyon has been intentionally hidden from the public by the Counter-Reformation, and that this attempt to hide the references in Revelation chapter 9 verse 11 to Apollyon stretch back as far as the Edict of Thessalonica, and the translation of the Latin Vulgate itself by Jerome. And you saw how John placed the upsilon into his reference to Apollo, to echo the same warning Christ gave his disciples about the broad way of religious commercialism which leads to damnation, and the straight and narrow way, or straight street, which led directly to homes, and symbolized the choice one had to make, to find life with God, and a future in heaven. And you saw how the Roman synthesis chose the broad way, and reinterpreted all the symbolism, exactly reverse of how it was intended to be understood in the New Testament, down to even applying the critical decision symbolized in the upsilon as applying to the sunrise, or the sunset. And you saw how the Masons promoted themselves and their ideology as stemming from the same Byzantium army, which is described as the locust army of the Antichrist, in Revelation chapter 9 verses 1 through 12. And how they carry with them to this day, the same solar cult synthesis of Apollo and Christ, devised under Constantine, centuries ago. So far in our topical study connected to Revelation chapter 9, we have already covered 5 of our 8 topics. And as you have already seen, there is a tremendous amount of disinformation that the Counter-Reformation has used to attempt to bury the historic contents of Revelation chapter 9 under. They have piled more disinformation on top of this one chapter than almost any other chapter in the entire book of Revelation. The reason for that, of course, is that if you do understand what is really written in Revelation chapter 9, you will immediately realize that the vast majority of institutionalized religion in Western society under the name of Christianity is not even really Christian at all. It is actually anti-Christian. Or as John actually called it historically, Antichrist. It worships as its definition of Christ, something the New Testament authors were identifying as the worship of Satan, and the great delusion, which would ultimately end in the damnation of its adherents, participants and promoters. Because it was the continued worship of the Roman sun deity Apollo, under the false guise of Christ. And it was developed fully and intentionally from the beginning of its institutionalism to be the exact and precise opposite of what is found in the New Testament. This opposite nature is not accident. Unfortunately, neither are the opposite spiritual consequences that come along with that intentional reversal in the definition of God for people who think they are following Christ. When the historic fact is, they have been intentionally deceived into following a very cruel deception, which is in reality its exact and precise opposite. In the last 3 topics on Revelation chapter 9, we will cover the final 3 intentional lies that the Counter-Reformation uses to hide the contents of this chapter. Then in the following video, we will exegete the entire chapter verse by verse, showing its amazing fulfillment in history. And how that amazing fulfillment is being intentionally hidden for some very unsavory political purposes. The last 3 topics are 1. The claim that 4 demons are in the Euphrates River, that will be released to cause World War III in Armageddon. 2. The text refers to atomic bombs in 3. And that the text says there will be an invasion ground force, which will invade Israel during this war, of 200 million men, led by a still future, end of the world, Antichrist. As you will see in a moment, these are nothing more than a continuation of the intentional lying that you have already seen exposed in the previous 5 topics. So naturally, you will find that trend of intentional deception and disinformation will remain unbroken through the final claims of their cover story to hide the final parts of this chapter. First, we will begin with the claim that the text refers to 4 river demons in the Euphrates that will come out and start World War III, or what they call Armageddon, which according to them, was going to happen in 2012. And before that, 2010. And before that, 2008. And before that 2006, and before that 2004, and before that 2001, and before that 1999, and before that 1998, and before that 1997, and before that 1996. Well, you get the picture. The fact is, they have been claiming it was all going to happen sometime next year, since they invented that fraudulent theology, as a hoax, 5 centuries ago. And nothing has changed despite their continual false claims. The first topic we will look at in this final video on our topical study concerning Revelation chapter 9, is found in verses 14 and 15 and reads as follows in the King James Version. Quote, saying to the 6th angel which had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, for to slay the 3rd part of men. End quote. Counter-Reformation theology interprets this text by claiming 1. The 4 angels are actually 4 demons in the river. 2. The time frame given is completely symbolical, and 3. The value of 1/3 part of men is literal and refers to the whole world. And thus therefore this text, despite the fact it is in chapter 9, is making a reference to the same Battle of Armageddon, mentioned 7 chapters later, in Revelation chapter 16 to 16. So what are the problems with those claims? The problem is, every claim counter-reformationists make concerning this text, is simply demonstrably false. All 3 of them. First, the text does not say, demons. It says angels. There is a word in Greek for demons and it is not used here. The word used in this text translated as angels is the Greek word, angelos, and is transliterated into English, as angels. There are no demons in this text. Secondly, the most literal part of the text is John's time frame value, which counter-reformationists completely ignore because they don't want any time frames acknowledged in Revelation at all, except those that they use to fit into their eschatology scheme. So they just ignore all the rest, as you will see done here. But you can't honestly do that. If you ignore them here, you must ignore them everywhere. If you accept them in some sections, then you must accept them in all sections. That arbitrary use of time frame references is inconsistent and dishonest, and thus hypocritical. There is a time frame in this text, and it can't be swept under the rug. And guess what? That time frame reference completely invalidates any claim to a 7-year tribulation period. That is why they ignore it, and turn it into a meaningless symbol. Thirdly, they claim that the reference to slaying a 3rd part of men, is a reference to all humanity on earth. The only problem is that, if you take that interpretation, then you have a very big mathematical problem once again. As you have seen in previous videos, counter-reformation theology has a very serious problem when it comes to math. The math of the theology simply does not add up, mathematically. And you will see that problem illustrated, once again, in this text. Let's begin with the first claim that there are 4 river demons that will come out of the Euphrates River. Where does the counter-reformation get that from, and is there any validity to that claim, either in the text or in history? Falling inside your face? How can you do that? What about wearing a crown inside your head? Or people living in the soil? Or rulers that sit not on thrones, but inside of the thrones? If you believe there are 4 angels bound inside the river Euphrates, then you must believe all these other crazy things as well. Why, you ask? Because the same Greek word is used to describe all these different situations. And if you translate verse 14 to mean there are 4 angels bound in the river Euphrates, then you must also translate all these other verses to mean inside as well. And when you do that, your expressions become so mangled and distorted, you will sound like a crazy person. And there is a very strange reason this word has been intentionally mistranslated in verse 14. An historical reason that you will discover to be absolutely amazing. In chapter 9 verse 14 there is a strange expression in English that says, quote, "Loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates." End quote. This is an extremely strange phrase, because in English, it is translated so it sounds like the text is saying there are 4 angels bound in the river. That is precisely what the English says, and that is precisely what the English translation means. The oddity of that phrase hinges on a single word in that sentence. That is the word translated as the preposition in. Bound in the river sounds much different than bound upon the river, or bound at the river, or bound by the river, or bound beyond the river, etc., etc. So you see, if you change the English translation of that one word, the entire sentence reads very different, so the entire very odd expression rests on one Greek word alone, in that phrase. But here is what is very very odd, about how that word was translated. The English word in that text, translated as the word in, comes from the Greek word epi. It is a very common preposition in the New Testament. It occurs 885 times, and has a wide variety of application, usually meaning upon, or on, or beyond, or at, in English, but honestly, it rarely means the equivalent of our English word in, as meaning inside of. Rarely. Out of 885 times, only about 12% of the time is it even translated as the word in by the King James Version. And in many if not most of these instances, which occur only about 12% of the time, they represent simply an accommodation of English expression usage, not what the text actually says or means. For example, in Matthew chapter 23, verse 2, the phrase is written, "They sit in Moses' seat." That is simply a linguistic accommodation because the text literally says they sit upon Moses' seat. And literally speaking, they did not sit inside of the seat of Moses, they sat upon it. Which is precisely what the Greek word epi actually literally, really, means. Not in, but upon. So there must be some very strange reason why the King James Version translators chose to use that English word in rather than upon, or beyond, or at, as it is usually translated everywhere else, with this word. The Greek word epi is used 140 times, just in the book of Revelation, alone. In chapter 9, the term is actually used 5 times. 4 other times in just this chapter. To illustrate how bad a translation it is, to translate this word as in, we will look at its use just within this one chapter, and around this text in Revelation. And if you do that, you will notice, if you take this Greek term, epi, and translate it to mean in, as in the English sense of inside of, rather than upon, on, beyond, or at, as it is properly used elsewhere, look what it does to the other texts that are used right here, in this very chapter, and its surrounding material. In verse 7, John says he sees something like crowns of gold, epi, translated as on their heads. This text would need to be changed from crowns of gold on their heads to crowns of gold inside their heads. Do you wear gold crowns on your head, or inside your head? Wearing a gold crown inside your head would be pretty funny, wouldn't it? In verse 17, John says in his vision, he sees horses and them that sat, epi, translated as upon them. This text would need to be translated to, John says, he sees in his vision, horses and them that sat, inside them. Do riders of horses sit inside the horses, or do they sit upon the horses? In the previous chapter, in chapter 8, verse 13, John says he sees an angel flying in mid-heaven saying woe, 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 to the inhabitants, epi, translated by the King James translation as the word of the earth. If you take the Greek word epi to mean within or inside, then the text would read woe to the inhabitants within the earth, suggesting, inside the soil of the earth, it is populated by soil people. The correct translation is the word upon. People live upon the earth, not inside it. In the next chapter, in chapter 10 verse 1, John says he sees an angel with a rainbow, epi, translated upon his head. Once again, if you translate epi as meaning inside of, then John is saying there is a rainbow inside his head, not upon it. In chapter 11 verse 16 he speaks about 24 elders he sees sit, epi, translated as on their seats, and they fall, epi, translated as on their faces to worship God, referring to a Middle Eastern prostrate position of prayer. If you take the term epi to mean inside of, or within, then you would have to translate this text as 24 elders who sit inside the seats, and fall inside their face and worship God. Have you ever seen anyone sitting inside a seat? Or falling inside their face? Translating the Greek term epi, as in, meaning inside, is simply a very bad translation of this Greek word, especially in this text, because it makes people think precisely as many do, that John was referring to 4 angels bound inside the river, when in fact, he was referring to 4 messengers bound upon, on, beyond, or at, the river Euphrates. Meaning very clearly, the river Euphrates is a boundary, marking the edge of 4 geopolitical entities he is referencing in his text. It is very clear what he is referring to, if you use the correct meaning of the Greek term epi in the English translation. But for some obvious reason, the King James translators did not want to be clear. They wanted this text intentionally obfuscated, for some strange reason. So the question naturally arises, why did they do that? What mystery on earth explains this very strange way the King James intentionally mistranslated this text in verse 14? You are about to discover why, in just a few minutes, and you will be amazed at the origin of this corruption in the King James Version. It goes straight back to ancient Babylon, and something called Mystery Babylon, mentioned by John in chapter 17. There are 4 major problems with a claim that chapter 9 verse 15 refers to river demons which will crawl out of the Euphrates River. Any one of which should be the end of that claim, for an honest student of Scripture. First, the claim ignores the prophetic timeframes that are given in the text. Secondly, the claim conflates 2 separate events into a single event. Thirdly, it violates the actual language of the text itself. And fourthly, it validates Babylonian sorcery, as John's actual explanation of biblical eschatology. As you saw in Part 11, on the astronomically dated timeline, Revelation chapter 9, verse 15 is dated prophetically at around 1200 AD. The only way you can move this event involving the Euphrates River to the end of time is to simply ignore all John's timeline material found through the previous 9 chapters in the book, and arbitrarily place it at the end of time. And that is precisely what the Counter-Reformation does. But as you have seen previously, this completely arbitrary way of handling time frame material is hypocritical. You either have a time frame, or you don't have any. You cannot simply pick and choose time frame material whenever it fits a preconceived notion. You have to remain consistent with the author's use of time frame material. Otherwise, you are just making things up to fit a predetermined conclusion that you are forcing onto the text. Or in other words, you are simply using inkblot, free association, to interpret the biblical text. And that was obviously not the intent of the author. The second problem Counter-Reformation theology creates in this textual trick is that there are 2 events involving the Euphrates River. This is only the first. The second event occurs in chapter 16. Counter-Reformation theology reads all repetitive, or cyclical events, as the same event, because they are trying to collapse everything into just 7 years. Of course, the only way that can be done is to ignore all time frame material which spread these events out beyond 7 years, and select only references that could be taken to fit a 7-year time frame. Many duplicate or cyclical events are collapsed into a single event, even though the author has separated them by several chapters and hundreds or even thousands of years, and is time frame material. It is not a very honest way to handle the text. The second reference to the Euphrates River comes a full 7 chapters later, and there is time frame material in virtually all of these 7 chapters, placing the second event involving the Euphrates River centuries later at best. And if you compare the surrounding textual material in these 2 chapters, despite the common reference to the Euphrates River and armies from the east, they have nothing else in common. They are describing 2 completely different sets of circumstances, separated by a very extensive time frame, all of which you have to ignore. This problem drives students of premillennial rapture eschatology absolutely crazy, because they all know they are attempting to solve a problem that should not be there to begin with. When they try to sort out their 3 sets of judgments, never noticing why there are 3 to begin with, they find they can get no logical order out of any of it, because the 7th judgment in each set begins the next set. so John has obviously established some kind of chronology. But if you take them all as referring to 7 years only, you have to stick them on top of each other, and make them congruent. Meaning you have to take the first seal and the first trumpet and the first bowl, as all referring to only one event. But you obviously cannot do that the way John has written the material, because John forces the reader to get to the 7th seal, before he begins the first trumpet judgment. And then he forces the reader to get to the 7th trumpet judgment, before he begins the first bowl judgment. So once again, the only way a counter-reformation theologian can get them to all fit within a time frame of 7 years, is simply ignore the details, structure and actual language of the text. Or in other words again, simply use ink blot, free association, to interpret your texts. There is no way you can honestly collapse these two events found in chapter 9 and chapter 16 into one singular event, because John has established astronomically dated timelines in his texts, and he has laid it out in a literary structure that creates a chronological dependency on the occurrence of previous events before the occurrence of the next later events happen. And if all this were not enough on its own, the claim that verse 15 is referencing Babylonian river demons actually violates the language of the text itself. John does not reference Babylonian river demons. How do you know? Because that is not the language actually found in the text itself. There are no demons mentioned in verse 15. As you can clearly see from the English text, the word is angels, not demons. And any student of biblical literature can tell you, those are two entirely different things. Even if you take angels in the fully negative sense referring to angels of Satan or fallen angels, the terms still refer to two entirely different sets of entities. Fallen angels do not live in rivers. Nor were they destroyed by any flood. Nephilim, destroyed by the flood, in Jewish theology, gave rise to demonic spirits. But these were Nephilim, not fallen angels. So once again, to make that argument you have to 1. Ignore the language in the text, and 2. Conflate 2 separate things and dishonestly make them one. Here are the facts about this text. 1. Angels and demons are not the same thing, even when you reference the negative sense of the term, angel, and 2. The text itself specifies angels, not demons. Therefore, there are no demons mentioned in this text. That is simply just the grammatical fact of this text. It is that plain and simple. The word translated as angels is used 186 times in the New Testament and has a wide variety of usages. Out of 186 times, it is used approximately only 3 times in the negative sense. Once as a reference to messengers of Satan, referring to humans, and approximately twice to fallen angels. So its use in that regard is very rare, and usually made very clear by the surrounding textual material. The word angelos, however, is never translated as demons. The reason is that what the term angels refer to, even in a negative sense, is considered to be an entirely different set of entities than what the word demons refer to. So do not make the mistake of conflating these two entirely different references as the same. Because everyone fully knows, including counter-reformationists themselves, that is simply and truthfully not the case. They know they are telling a lie when it comes to that text. They actually know they are lying when they make that claim. It is not simply an accident, it is an intentional lie. A lie they feel they have to tell by rationalizing and justifying it, to keep their jobs, or their money. But that is precisely what they will do with verse 15. The fourth problem counter-reformation theology creates is that they turn John's reference away from what he actually wrote to make it a reference to an event in Babylonian sorcery. So what's the problem with that? It's very revealing about the actual real source of this theology and eschatology. In chapter 17, verse 5, John mentions something called Mystery Babylon. Quote, "And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth." End quote. Most scholars throughout history have recognized this as a very clear reference to the many mystery religions, which were present throughout the entire class structure of ancient Roman society, and which actually, really, historically, had their origins in the Babylonian Empire. These mystery religions or orders within Roman society were the origin of our modern Western fraternity and sorority, secret society class culture, which we still have present with us today. And the many class orders and societies found still today in the organization of the Catholic Church worldwide, such as the Knights of Columbus, the Jesuits, or for example, Opus Dei. In ancient Babylon, it was common practice in Babylonian sorcery to attempt to trap and use the power of demons. The pictures on your screen are pictures of ancient Babylonian demon bulls recovered from archaeologists in modern-day Iraq. These bowls were inscribed with magical incantations and with pictures of particular demons, and then placed upside down in the ground to trap the demon. Once it was believed that a demon had been trapped, the owner of the bowl, doing the sorcery, could then send it out to do malicious things to one's enemies. Sort of like an ancient form of Babylonian voodoo. Instead of pins in a doll, they used magic bowls with magic incantations inscribed on the inside. Babylon was full of magic rituals, invoking the use of demons to punish, reward and manipulate society. Some of these ancient magic rituals are still conducted in different forms in several of these secret societies, orders and organizations, even today. But they have been sanitized and repackaged into different forms for modern consumption. Christmas, believe it or not, is actually one of these ancient rituals. There are legends of ancient Babylonian sorcerers trapping demons not just in the earth, but in rivers as well. One particular famous story involves 4 demons trapped by a sorcerer in the river Euphrates, which counter-reformationists invoke as the inspiration for their interpretation on verse 15. But the problem with that claim is threefold. The scriptures never gave credence to the idea that demons could ever be trapped or manipulated toward human ends. Demons are depicted similar to dangerous angry wild animals that are not domesticated for human purposes. In fact, in biblical literature, the warning is clearly presented to its readers: entertaining and playing with demons would be a good way to become demonized, or even possessed, by one, or even hundreds of them. That idea is presented as not only dangerous and foolish by biblical authors, but they described it, in very negative unacceptable terms, as sorcery, translated as witchcraft, into English. But that is actually the Hebrew word, kal-shof, which means to invoke incantations, or magic spells, using spirits, or trafficking in spirits. The Torah prescribed capital punishment for anyone caught doing that in Israel. So even if you couldn't read the text itself, it is very unlikely John would be giving credence to any sorcery legends from ancient Babylonian witchcraft about the Euphrates River. What is, however, much more likely, is that theological sources which engage in theological syncretism with Babylonian mystery religion, mentioned in chapter 17 of this very book, would include Babylonian sorcery, is actually part of their theology and eschatology, which is precisely what they do. And in order to get it to work, they use verse 15 like a sock puppet on their hand, and put words in John's mouth that he never said, or even wrote, in this text. Precisely as you might expect, from theology inspired by the Mystery Babylon theological sources of groups like the Vatican and the Masons. So you see, the claim that there are 4 river demons from ancient Babylonian sorcery trapped in the river Euphrates, which they claim will emerge at the end of time to initiate Armageddon, is not only a completely false claim about this text, but the claim itself reveals the involvement of those sources and their proponents in modern Mystery Babylon religion, which is brought up and condemned by John directly in chapter 17 of this very book. Should you really be getting your theology about anything in the book of Revelation directly from sources which are self-identified as Mystery Babylon? Seriously? That would be the last place on earth you would want to trust to be telling you the truth about who they are, when they themselves are directly mentioned in the texts of this book. That would be kind of like asking a Nazi to explain a speech written by the Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner, Elie Wiesel. You are probably not going to get an accurate explanation of its intended meaning. So don't ask a source that believes in the validity of Mystery Babylon religion to explain the book of Revelation to you, unless you want to be totally deceived about what it says. That should be common sense to anyone, that should not even have to be explained. but unfortunately, it actually does. That's the truth about the Counter-Reformation's claim about 4 demons in the river Euphrates. There is no such claim in the language of the text. It is actually a reflection of these sources' actual real involvement with Mystery Babylon and its syncretistic theology, specifically mentioned in Revelation 17 of this very book. It is much more likely that there are 4 Babylonian demons in the person telling you that lie than there are in the river Euphrates from this text. The second claim that the Counter-Reformationists make concerning this text involves verses 17 and 18. There they claim that the text describes atomic warfare and atomic bombs. Which would be fine if the Byzantium Roman army, in the 3rd century AD, had atomic weapons, but of course they didn't. And that is certainly not what John is prophesying in verses 17 and 18. How do we know that? Because John gets very specific about what his reference is actually describing. And it has nothing to do with nuclear bombs. As you will soon see. Revelation chapter 9 verses 17 and 18 read as follows in the King James Version. Quote, "And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them having breastplates of fire and of jacinth and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions. And out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. By these 3 was the 3rd part of men killed by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone, which issued out of their mouths." End quote. We will get into more detail when we exegete this whole chapter verse by verse in the next video. But these topical studies are important and necessary, because so much disinformation has been spread about chapter 9, that those false claims simply have to be addressed first. In verse 17 and 18 we run into the false claim that this text refers to atomic war. In fact, the claim has been made so often in our culture, that the term Armageddon has become, almost exclusively, a pop culture synonym for an atomic war. There may be an atomic war in the future. In fact, we have already had one atomic war, in World War II. And there may be more. But chapter 9 of Revelation has nothing to do with an atomic war. And the intellectual engineers of Counter-Reformation theology, who are spreading these lies, know they are lying to the public, and they already know what you are about to see, that prove these are lies. So the lies are not accidental. Nor are they spreading, simply, another interpretation. They are busy spreading things on purpose, that they simply know are not true to this text. They know that, and spread those claims anyway, with no conscience about what they are doing. Despite the fact the Counter-Reformation publicly denies what this text actually refers to, they know their denials are complete fabrications. They know, just like anyone who actually reads the text, that the claim these verses refer to a modern atomic war are proven false by the following objective facts concerning this text. 1. The Counter-Reformation knows atomic bombs do not exist in the time frame John places these events. 2. The Counter-Reformation also knows atomic bombs are actually eliminated by the language of the text itself. And 3. The Counter-Reformation knows their claim is proven false by the sheer math required by the claim itself. Let's look at these facts in more detail now, beginning with point number 1. Atom bombs do not exist in the time frame John places these events. John uses more than one method of dating the time frames in his texts. John's texts are dated using astronomical dating and time conversions, and thirdly, by textual content itself. So even if you attempted to deny his use of astronomical dating, and even if you ignore his use of time conversions, you are still stuck with dated references in the content of the texts themselves. So there is really no honest way. You can simply not see the time frames for his material, as counter-reformationists pretend they do. The reader is still stuck with dated material, obviously right in the middle of the description of the texts themselves. And this is what we find in chapter 9 verses 17 and 18. The army John is describing in verses 17 and 18, ride on horses and wear breastplates. That is an historical reference. You can't do anything with that reference other than simply ignore it, if you are a counter-reformationist, claiming this is all in the future. Because obviously those are military conventions that are neither modern or future. It is dated material that places these events on the historical timeline, even if you simply chose to ignore every single timeline reference in the entire 8 previous chapters. You are still stuck with the creation of an historical time frame by the descriptions in the text themselves. Both in his reference to a geopolitical entity bordered by the Euphrates River, which is an historical reference, and by his reference to the fact they ride on horses and wear breastplates, John has dated this material to a particular period of history. And that is completely aside from the fact he has created a timeline, which is astronomically dated specifically to the early 1200s. And as you will see in the next video, when we exegete the entire chapter verse by verse, his prophecy in this text had an amazing and extremely obvious fulfillment in history, and it did so with astounding prophetic accuracy. Counter-reformationists will use the excuse that John didn't know what an atom bomb was, so he used descriptions that were familiar to him to describe these future events. But counter-reformationists themselves know that claim is a patently false claim and fabrication. Because while John obviously had never seen an atomic bomb, John was intimately familiar with the term atom, which was a term that did exist in his own day, in the very same Greek language he was writing his texts in, and there were even fairly lengthy conversations in Greek literature and philosophy about atoms, which he could have very easily made reference to, just as he does concerning Apollyon, the upsilon, the logos, and several other fairly well-known concepts from Greek philosophy and literature that he does in fact make reference to. So how could he make reference to all these other concepts from Greek philosophy and literature, and somehow have no capacity to mention the Greek atom? The Greeks taught that the atom was the smallest element of material reality. In fact, the term in Greek is where we actually get our modern English word atom from. It is actually a Greek word that did already exist in John's own day. The Greeks also proposed, however, that all reality was based on the atom, and it was both eternal and indestructible. So John would have been more than happy to prophetically describe an explosive weapon made from splitting the allegedly indestructible Greek atom, because it would have been a repudiation of the entire Greco-Roman paradigm of reality in his own day, if that is what he had actually been describing. But John did not do that, because that is not what he was describing. In fact, he didn't mention the very well-known concept of the atom at all, because that was not the time frame of history he was prophesying about in chapter 9. Why would he mention it when that is not what he is describing? There is no weapon made from splitting a Greek atom in chapter 9, which John did have both the language tools and concept of to mention. And he would have been more than happy to mention that somebody in the future had learned how to split one. Instead he mentions something else, just as prophetic, and just as important, in the development of military history, but a lot closer to his own time, not at the end of the world. And he mentions it with just as much detail and specificity as he would have if he had been prophesying a weapon made from splitting the indivisible and supposedly eternal Greek atom. And this brings us to our second point. 2. Atom bombs are actually eliminated by the language of the text. Not only does John not describe nuclear bombs in verses 17 and 18, he intentionally eliminates them as a possibility, because he gets very specific about the kind of fire he is describing by actually specifying the material that is used to create it. And he intentionally does not refer to the Greek atom known in his day. Instead he intentionally refers to something else, which is a material which was exactly and precisely accurate to the period of history he was describing on his historical timeline. Exactly. In fact, the two things coincide so dramatically and accurately, there is no way it could be coincidental. Precisely, as the Counter-Reformation already know, but chose to conceal from the public. And here is how you know they are hiding this reference. The Counter-Reformation knows verses 17 and 18 actually eliminate atomic bombs in the text itself. And here is how that claim is proven to be a ridiculous attempt at disinformation. Not just another interpretation. In verses 17 and 18, in the King James Version, in both verses, John associates the fire produced by this army with brimstone. That word, brimstone, is another amazing choice word, used by Counter-Reformation biblical translators, and you are going to see more about what is meant by that in just a few minutes. But right now, it is sufficient to note that when you look up the term brimstone, it is an archaic jargonized term, which simply means sulfur. Atomic bombs are obviously not made from sulfur, as you see explicitly stated in verses 17 and 18. But something else is. Atomic bombs are not shot by individuals, as you see described in verse 17, coming from their, plural, mouths. But something else is. Atomic bombs did not come from the east, or across the Euphrates, as you see stated in verse 14, but something else did. Atomic bombs are not shot while riding on horses as you see in verse 17. But something else is. Atomic bombs are not used against the first army, whose king is Apollyon, and who are wearing plate armor, and shooting scorpion bows, and riding on barded horses, as you see in verses 2 through 10, but something else was. Atomic bombs do not come from the region of anyone's mouths, as you see in verse 17. But something else does. And atomic bombs did not exist in the time frame John is describing, but something else did. These verses literally completely eliminate atomic bombs as the weapon being described in verses 17 and 18. And the Counter-Reformation knows precisely what that something else actually is, because they are using words to hide it in the text, which you will be shown in a few minutes. And finally, that brings us to the third proof, that the Counter-Reformation knows it is lying about this text with claims it refers to atomic bombs, or an atomic war. 3. The claim is proven false by the sheer math involved. As pointed out numerous times in previous videos, in the Greek text, the whole Earth or planet is never referenced. The Greek word mistranslated into English is the Greek word gay, and simply means generically, the land. And by extension, only a region. So their claims are completely based on disinformation from the English mistranslation. Counter-Reformationists know there is a contradiction in chapter 9 in their theology, with chapter 8. They have already claimed that 1/3 of the Earth has been destroyed by an asteroid. Most planetary scientists, whether from geology or astrophysics, will quickly tell you that if 1/3 of the planet is physically destroyed by that sizable an asteroid impact, the 2/3 of the planet that does remain will be virtually uninhabitable by any significant life, anyway. Planetary geology would collapse, land masses would be submerged under cataclysmic tsunamis, and the atmosphere would be annihilated by the event. It would be an extinction-level event. And the Earth at that point would become a dead planet. The story would end right there. But Counter-Reformation theology was formulated in medieval Europe, when there wasn't any planetary science in existence. So there was no one around, in terms of science, who could easily discredit that claim. The situation is a bit different today. Despite the fact that such a claim is considered pretty ridiculous by today's standards, they still continued to make it. The only problem is, even if you just outright reject the science about such a claim, the math itself demonstrates the claim to be completely fraudulent and self-nullifying. And it is quite impossible that the author of this literature would destroy the planet in one chapter in an extinction-level event, and then have armies busy fighting each other, as though nothing had ever happened, in the next. Even if he were intending to fabricate nothing more than a fiction. 1/3 of the Earth pulverized by an asteroid in chapter 8 is an extinction-level event, and leaves zero humanity left. And you cannot have 1/3 of humanity not even die yet, until a full chapter later, in a subsequent nuclear, global war. The math of this interpretation simply does not support the claim. And of course, as pointed out earlier, the Counter-Reformation already knows these claims are patently false. They are not spreading these views because they believe they are actually true. Their motivations are quite the opposite, instead. As you will now see. Today, the phrase, hell, fire, and brimstone is a commonly recognized phrase. It has entered the common vocabulary of modern pop culture. Despite the fact it is a very common reference, if you asked most people on the street to tell you what brimstone actually was, most would not be able to tell you. And that lack of information in public consciousness has been created intentionally in history. Just like you saw how the Counter-Reformation hid John's reference to the scorpion bow, and how they hid John's reference to Rome's Lorica segmentata plate armor, and how they hid John's reference to the Roman abyss with the phrase bottomless pit. So too, here, they are caught hiding another word. Most people think the term brimstone is a funny old Bible term that comes from a long time ago. But the truth of the matter is, the use of the term brimstone is actually not older than what it was used to hide. So what were the English translators actually attempting to hide? And why? As you saw earlier, brimstone is a term that refers to sulfur. Everyone knows what sulfur is. It's been around as a chemical substance, used for medicinal and commercial purposes, since before Christ was even born on the earth. It is a naturally occurring mineral in the earth's mantle. Our English word sulfur comes straight from Latin, and has been around in English a very long time too. Etymologies track the use of the word sulfur in English back to the 1300s, and trace its use to Latin prior to that. When you look up this text in the Latin Vulgate, which goes back to the 4th century, there you will actually find the term, just as it is in Greek, translated into Latin, reading, sulfur. You can even see the word sulfur in the Latin text. It is immediately recognizable, even if you can't read Latin. But here is what is so very odd about all this. When you take a look at the numerous English translations, especially those connected with Counter-Reformation sources, you will see that from the 1600s forward, 3 entire full centuries after the term sulfur is already being used as a common term in English, they all chose to use the archaic and rather antiquated term, brimstone. Brimstone. Not sulfur, but brimstone. And when they made the decision to use brimstone, it was already an archaic, obsolete and antiquated usage in English by 3 centuries. Which is really bizarre. You will find the word brimstone used in the Douay-Rheims version used by the Catholic Church. You will see brimstone used in every major version, from the 1611 King James Version, right up into the modern King James Version, used by the Masons. You will see the word brimstone used in the Counter-Reformationist Darby version. You will see the word brimstone used in the Anglican Bishop's Bible. You will see the word brimstone used in the Revised Version, and you will even see the word brimstone used in the relatively modern American Standard Version. It is clear these translators, linguistically, were going several centuries out of their way to revive an already antiquated term, to bury the commonly recognized term it hid. So how did this happen? How did the antiquated term brimstone get used to bury the commonly recognized term, sulfur, and why did they do that? The first rather odd thing you will be told when researching this term, brimstone, is that it is an archaic biblical term that refers to sulfur. That is the one thing all reference sources agree on. But that is not actually the whole story. True, brimstone is an archaic biblical term, alright. It had been used and replaced by the term sulfur. The problem is that replacement occurred long before any of these biblical translations were even produced. When you look up the etymology of the term brimstone, you will find some amazing anachronisms. The term anachronism refers to things which are out of place in time or chronology. For example, you can see on the Google chart on your screen the popularity of the term brimstone actually peaked in the 1800s, around the same exact time C.I. Scofield was out peddling his Counter-Reformation theology in America. Something happened in the history of linguistic usage that revived the term brimstone after its common usage had disappeared. So what is the real story of how brimstone actually came down to us today? And why was the archaic term brimstone retained for centuries, long past its common use? In order to intentionally avoid the original term in the text, sulfur. Here is the etymology of the term sulfur. As you can see on your screen, this term goes back to the 1300s in English. And before the 1300s, it went straight back to Latin. The Geneva Bible was not printed until the mid-1500s, as you have already seen in the previous video on crossbows and scorpions. So the English term sulfur already had an established use in English 2 entire centuries before the first Bible was ever even printed. The King James Bible was not printed until 1611, and the English term sulfur had an established use in English 3 entire centuries before the King James Bible was even published. So there would be no excuse for a 1611 King James translation Bible to reject the actual word found in the Latin Vulgate itself for a much older, already antiquated English term. The story deepens a bit when you start tracking how it came about. If you notice in the etymology, the documented use of the term sulfur in English begins around the 1300s. One reformer, by the name of John Wycliffe, and who lived 3 centuries before the King James Version, translated the Bible into English, in defiance of the Pope. John Wycliffe, a Catholic priest, and professor at Oxford University in England, not only translated the Bible into English, he had openly and publicly identified the papacy as the biblically prophesied seat of the Antichrist. In 1428, 44 years after his death, Pope Martin V declared him a heretic, dug up his body, burned his bones, and had them thrown into the River Swift at Lutterworth, England. When Wycliffe did his translation into English, it was in the 1300s, 3 centuries before the King James Version, and at that time, the word used in English was brimstone. It is the Middle English version of our current word, brimstone. Wycliffe did not do that in order to hide the term sulfur. He used that term because when he did his translation, there was no other commonly used term in Middle English for sulfur, because this was during the 1300s. The Masonic translators of the King James Bible did not necessarily like the reformer Catholic priest, John Wycliffe, nor did they follow his translation. In fact, many religious historians have effectively argued that the entire reason King James created an authorized English version Bible was to get rid of Wycliffe's translation, along with all his now Protestant followers, called the Lollards. By the time the King James Version was translated, and all these other versions which would follow began their publication, the term sulfur, in English, had been used openly and commonly for literally several centuries. Justifying the use of brimstone in the term brimstone was actually a linguistic regression back to the Middle English of the 1300s, 3 centuries earlier, to intentionally avoid use of the current English term, sulfur. Why did the illustrious and Masonic King James not want his subjects reading the word sulfur in their version of Revelation chapter 9 verses 17 and 18? Well, because that would have interfered with King James's national security. You see, sulfur, in the day of King James, was still in the apex of one of the most important military developments in the history of the world. And it was a military development that King James, along with many of the other kings in Europe, desperately needed to continue to acquire and develop as a weapon technology. What was this history-changing epic military development that King James of England desperately needed a whole lot more of, that used sulfur? Why, of course, it was gunpowder, made straight from sulfur. And how did Europe get gunpowder? It was brought to Europe by the Mongol invasion in the 1200s, from across the Euphrates River, which bordered their empire, composed of 4 khans, whose empire developed into existence, with the goal of conquering Papal Europe over a period of 4 centuries, or as John puts it, 396 years. And now you know why you will read the word brimstone in your English translation instead of the actual word from the Greek and Latin texts, sulfur. And you also know that they know this prophecy was fulfilled in history. And they want it obfuscated rather than revealed. Every time you see the use of that antiquated and archaic jargonized word, brimstone, that makes absolutely no sense at all in biblical translations into English, you can now be reminded that they do, in fact, fully know what it is they have hidden from you. And it is factually documented that they have gone 300 years out of their way to make sure it stays exactly and precisely that way. Hidden. You don't hide something that does not exist. You hide things that do. Verses 17 and 18 clearly describe the introduction of gunpowder from east of the Euphrates by a terrible army God raised up against the army of the Antichrist. And the text gets even more unmistakably specific than just the gunpowder, by pointing out the location of the fire that is coming from their mouths. Amazingly, the Mongolian hand cannon, which was the earliest form of the rifle in history, emerged onto the battlefields of Europe, against Rome's Byzantium army equipped with their scorpion crossbows, dressed in plated armor, and barded cavalry, precisely as described in the latter half of Revelation chapter 9. And decimated them militarily. And this happened in history, precisely when John said these events would occur, centuries before they occurred. The Mongolian hand cannon, shooting fire and smoke made from sulfur, was held to the mouth, in order to aim and fire. Precisely as John describes seeing. Just as rifles are still positioned to aim, to this very day. They are literally pressed up, against the mouth. And that is why John saw smoke and fire coming from their mouths. That is literally where the strange device was held. And its opening at the end of its barrel, was called its mouth. And the end of the gun barrel, is still today called, the mouth, into our very own day. Still today. The people putting the archaic word, brimstone, into your English Bible translations, know exactly what all this was about, in history. They just did not want you to know, what they did. Otherwise, you might see, who they really were in history. If you had absolutely no idea about John's astronomical dating of his texts, and really didn't understand too much about parsing Greek texts, you would still be able to come to the right place in history with these texts, because of one very simple and obvious reason. In verse 7, it mentions armies riding on horses, and in verse 9, mentions they are wearing plate armor, and in verse 17, it mentions the introduction of gunpowder from an army from the east. If you did nothing more than Google all that, or even if you just used a little basic common sense from history, it would place you in the right period of history, not at the end of the world as counter-reformationists claim. And the text makes these references in some very specific, very unmistakable ways. So in other words, as you will soon see, you really have to intentionally not want to see what is in Revelation 9, in order to miss it. And that is precisely what the counter-reformationists teach people to do. And if you are, just a little more diligent and honest, in your study of the New Testament scriptures, you might even notice that a Greco-Roman deity is literally mentioned by name in verse 11. And if you did nothing more than Google that name, and do a little study on that from credible historical sources, you would discover it was a well-known Greco-Roman deity that was merged with the identity of Sol Invictus in the 3rd century. Which would once again put you right in the middle of the correct time frame in history for the text. So the details of Revelation chapter 9 puts the Counter-Reformation in a serious jam. And in order to get out of that jam, they used 3 different tricks or gimmicks on this text. Some might be offended that they are here called tricks, and not simply alternate interpretations. But the phrase, alternate interpretation, doesn't account for the real nature of the theological tactic used. When you pass on an idea that you factually know is not true, it no longer counts as simply another interpretation. When you know it is not true, but pass it along anyway for nothing more than intentionally victimizing or deceiving your audience. And the third trick they use is that they take another clearly symbolic or metaphorical statement and demand a strictly hyperliteralistic meaning in order to put it out of the reach of any real history, ever. The reference is in verse 16, which mentions 200 myriads of myriads, and it was a well-known Greek idiomatic expression, also known as a quote, indefinite hyperbolic qualifier. It was well known in the 1st century AD. Why? Because it was in Plato's law. And the expression was cited by Plato to refute the self-righteousness and presumptive arrogance of local Greeks, and refer to all the other nations on earth. It was a well-known quote, often invoked to rebuke the presumption of being right. Plato also referred to their belief in their own egocentric correctness as, quote, an intoxication. The same language John also uses of Mystery Babylon in chapter 17, John frequently makes references to Plato among the Greeks in his other literature as well. The entire Gospel of John is premised around Plato's prophecy of the coming Logos, which would reveal itself to the world. He opened the Gospel of John citing that very prophecy by Plato. His reference to myriads of myriads echoes Plato's use of this phrase, and even carries with it the implication it had in its original use by Plato. John uses the same language from Plato in Revelation chapter 9, verse 16 as a rebuke to the army of verse 7. Only he doubles down on it for emphasis. Or in other words, John is stating that God is pointing out to the army of verse 7, they are wrong times 2 via Plato's expression concerning their self-made law. And he is using a hyperbolic numeric qualifier as a literary device, and doubling it for emphasis. The same way we would say a bazillion times 2 in our own day. Nobody today would take the term bazillion to mean a literal number, unless they were simply a moron. The problem is that many of the men who are at the top of the food chain among the counter-reformationists are very educated and intelligent people, who clearly know what they are doing when they do this. They hide the reference in Plato's law, and in common culture at the time. And they take this known hyperbolic numeric qualifier used by Plato, which was cited all over the ancient Roman Empire, and demand its literal fulfillment only, or nothing counts. The point of all those contortions and distortions is not the fulfillment of anything, but to invalidate any fulfillment at all in history, no matter what it is, from ever happening. They want it to remain always in the future, and always out of reach of ever entering real human history, and thus meaning something. And here's the factual proof of that assertion. It is as clear as math. If you simply look up the math, you will realize how stupid this claimed interpretation actually is. If you never question a single word of what counter-reformationists tell you about this text, and take everything they say at face value, what would the math of 200 million actually look like, if you take it absolutely 100% literally? Let's entertain that claim for just a moment. 200 myriad is 200 million. But that is not actually the size of the whole army mentioned in the text. That was a reference to the horsemen of the army, only. Just the horsemen. The actual army would be even much larger than that. It is made clear in the text that he is referring to the quote, number of horsemen, end quote. That is a specific reference to its cavalry only, not including its navy and infantry. The reason the cavalry is singled out is that the smallest part of an army was its cavalry. It was the most expensive, hardest to transport, most skilled and required the most support. Thus other parts of an army would naturally be even larger than their cavalry. So if we take 200 million cavalry plus at least 200 million infantry and 200 million sailors, we are not looking at an army of 200 million but more in the range of 600 million. This would not be any literal army on Earth, ever. Why is that? See, now we are going to get into the actual nuts and bolts of this claim. Especially the nutty part. First of all, if you have a cavalry of 200 million, the only thing that makes a cavalry, actually a cavalry, is a big O, horse. Which means you have to have 200 million horses. You can't have a cavalry of 200 million horsemen, with no horses. The counter-reformationists don't seem to think having a cavalry of 200 million horses is much of a problem. But that's because they either never had a horse, or they are dishonest liars, and telling lies doesn't really bother their conscience that much. They like to claim this figure of a cavalry of 200 million is modern China because China is the only country on Earth with a population that can produce an army of 200 million. Sounds impressive. That's right, China has a lot of people in it. Of course, when they brag about that fact, they simply ignore the text itself, which specifies this number as the number of horsemen only. Then they get the viewer to think that because China has all these people, and can produce a 200 million man army, it therefore simply must be the fulfillment of that prophecy. But then they ignore the fact that that same army would need, at a very minimum, 200 million horses. And the truth is that cavalries carried many more horses than riders because horses often got sick and died along the way, and got killed in battle. It was the common practice of the day for cavalries to carry up to 5 and 6 horses per rider in their cavalry invasion forces. So 200 times 5 would actually be 1 billion. So you would need a livestock caravan of 1 billion horses, in order to support a cavalry of 200 million horsemen. Let me repeat that again just in case you actually missed it. That is an invasion support force that would be herding 1 billion horses to the front. Is that ever going to happen at any point in the history of the world? No. And that is precisely the place they want their audiences to go. A place of non-historical fantasy. There are not 1 billion horses on the entire planet. There are an estimated 58 million horses in the world, if you add up every single horse on the planet from every nation on Earth. How far away from 1 billion horses are you still? You are not even close, as you will soon see. Well, you might say, maybe there will never be 1 billion horses on Earth, but what about China? Couldn't China come up with a 200 million man cavalry? What if you just had 1 horse per man? Couldn't China come up with 200 million horses? Well, actually no, they could not. Not even if they had only 1 single horse per man, they still couldn't do it. Why is that? Simple. There are not that many horses in the entire country of China. If China used every single horse in its entire country, they would be able to provide only 0.03% of a livestock count for a 200 million horse cavalry. Only 0.03%. This is what 0.03% looks like on a graph, just in case you can visualize how far from reality this claim really is. The entire country of China only has a little more than 7 million horses in its entire country. 7 is a long way from 200. 200 divided by 7 is 28. You would need 28 more entire country of China's to get to 200 million horses. Even if you used every single horse in existence. You might say, but wait, maybe they could steal horses from other countries in the world? The problem is, even if they did that, it still would not get you anywhere even close to 200 million horses. Why? Because every horse on planet Earth, and remember we are literally talking, every single horse on the entire planet, is only about 58 million horses. That's still only 29% of what you need. You would still need another 2 entire planets of horses. Let's say that again. You would need 3 entire Earths, using every single horse on the entire planet, to come up with the minimum number of horses for that scenario to ever happen. Just for 1 horse per man. Not 5 horses per man. Just 1. You would need 3 Earths of horses using every single horse in existence on each planet. Just to get to 200 million. And if you ever wanted to get to a real number of horses, for a functional cavalry of 200 million horsemen, you would need not 3 Earths, but 15 Earths using every single horse on each planet Earth. That's 15 Earths. Not just 3. And the problem is not just the horses either. Even if you just completely ignore the actual text which clearly refer to horsemen, not infantry or navy, even if you just stick with 200 million and just take that as men with no horses, precisely as counter-reformationists wish you to take it, it's still not, even, a realistic number. Even then. Not even if you stretch the truth, and bend the text, to fit your preconceived ideas. 200 million is not an easy number to come up with for any aspect of an army, much less a cavalry. But even if you take every stretched contorted word they tell you, and even if you just willfully ignore the text's clear reference to horsemen, you still have some major problems getting an invasion force of 200 million, even if you can find the 200 million men. Today, with the global population of 6 billion people on the Earth, it is still hard to come up with an explanation for an army with 200 million soldiers. The United States has a global army of 1.5 million, which is the second largest army on Earth. China has the largest army with 2.3 million active military personnel. That includes all military forces of every kind. 2 million. How big is 2 million? If you take 2.3 million and divide it by 200 million on an Excel spreadsheet, it is 0.01% of 200 million. So citing China's military size literally doesn't even get you close to this number. It's not even close. China today, in a world of 6 billion people, is only 0.01% of that figure, and that is including every single active Chinese military person on Earth. How many Earths of Chinese military people would you need to get your army of 200 million? Well, let's figure that out. If we take 200 million and divide it by 2.3 million, it will give us the number 86.95 or about 87. Meaning not only would we need every single horse on 15 Earths to get the right number of horses for a cavalry of 200 million, we would need 86 more Earths of active Chinese military personnel. Let's say that again, just in case you missed it. We actually need another 86 more Earths of Chinese military personnel to get a Chinese military of 200 million, and that's 200 million in any capacity, which is not what the text even says. That is accepting the Counter-Reformation's lie about the text, on face value, precisely as they contort it. And that's every single active Chinese military person on Earth, all 87 Chinas of them put together, along with every military janitor, and every military secretary. Not just an invasion force. Oh, wait, that's still not all the problems there is with their ridiculous claims about a literalistic 200 million horseman army. Let's just forget you need 15 Earths just for the horses, and 87 Earths for the people. Let's just conveniently forget, like they do, that is actually how ridiculous their claim actually is. Let's just forget about that, and assume they have their army of 200 million, and they don't need to be riding horses, even though that's what it says it refers to. Let's just take the idea of 200 million soldiers on a modern battlefield with no further requirements, and see what that would look like. Let's see how realistic that claim actually is based on nothing more than the sheer logistics such a claim requires. China today has a population of 1.3 billion people. It has a landmass of 3.7 million square miles. That comes out to 351 people per square mile. It is the most populated nation on Earth. But when you start talking about a military invasion force, then you have to begin discussing physical logistics. And even if you take the text as completely literal, you are still going to end up actually having to take it as nothing more than symbolism, even in its most literalistic reading, completely ignoring the fact it is a known hyperbolic numeric metaphor. Here's why. It's one thing just to say, the text says 200 million and, oh look, here's a country with 1.3 billion people. Ta-da! It's China. Problem solved. Let's look at it a little closer. The text doesn't say there is a general population of 200 million. It doesn't say there are 200 million military personnel. The text says there is an invasion force of 200 million. And it actually specifies they are cavalry. But we will ignore that fact for now. It is clearly the invasion force John is making reference to. So let's figure out what an invasion force of 200 million marshaled soldiers on a battlefield actually look like, all lined up to attack in battle. When soldiers are marching, they are compact and ordered neatly in rows to take up the least amount of space necessary to march forward. This is a measurable space. The legs are kicked out at 45-degree angles, taking up about half the body space of the waist down if they are in rows. If they are side to side in a compact frontline row, they maintain about 18 inches distance on either side, if they are in a side-to-side, classical battle charge formation, like you would see in a Civil War or Revolutionary War movie. And that is about as compact as an army can get on a battlefield. If you added 2 feet for the width of the body itself, that would come out to about a minimum of 5 feet of ground space per soldier. And we are being ridiculously compact here, based on a model of warfare that is not even any longer practiced. But we are trying to argue against a fantasy to begin with, so let's use the realistic minimum it could possibly be. If they are marching in rows, the space would be about the same front to back or side to side, perhaps a little more front to back. But at a minimum, a soldier's body space would take up about 5 feet, side to side or front to back. And once again, probably more front to back. 5 feet would be a conservative estimate of marching body space, including the space of the soldier's body itself in an upright position, taking up a small 2 feet, with only 18 inches on either side. That comes out to 5 feet, with only 18 inches on either side, so that is very compact. So if we have 200 million soldiers, actually marching into battle side by side in an invasion force, body to body, with only 18 inches apart, and we just completely forget the very large horse this cavalry is supposed to be riding on, and we have only just a single soldier marching next to another single soldier, then we end up with a physical geological land surface space of 5 feet times 200 million. You see the problem? 5 feet of space times 200 million. Do you know that comes out to be 1 billion feet of land surface space? 1 billion feet of physical geological space. How big is that? There are 5,280 feet in a mile, so if we take 1 billion and divide it by 5,280 feet, we get 189,394 miles of land surface covered by a marching army of 200 million soldiers. How big is 189,394 miles? The circumference of the Earth is 24,860 miles. Or in other words, this army in the classical battle charge formation, positioned side to side, 18 inches apart, would stretch around the world 7.6 times. This army would wrap all the way around the Earth 7.5 different times, or once around 7 different Earths each. We are back to multiple Earths all over again, to get these numbers. Does that sound like anything realistic to you? Even if they could get the physical human bodies to pile up like that, there is no way to explain the surface land mass those numbers amassed on a single battlefield would require, in a real invasion force of that physical size, to simply march on, even if they were in a nice neat compact battle charge formation. Nobody marches an army like that into battle anymore, because you just get shot like a mannequin. The truth is, a modern army of that size spread out with supplies, vehicles and armaments, and they would require even more land mass than exists in the entire Middle East. So you see why claiming there will be an invasion force of 200 million soldiers is like trying to claim there really will be literally a bazillion? Even if you could justify the stupidity of the claim itself, you can't physically get that many people onto a single landmass for a targeted military invasion, even if you wanted to. You would have to have the land surface space of the equivalent of 186,000 miles of geography just to do it. So even the military logistics of this claim alone simply require the language to be understood precisely as it should be, as a metaphorical expression, not a literalistic body count. When you hear a counter-reformationist demand 200 million must be interpreted as absolutely strictly and only as a literal number, then ask him where is he going to get 15 planet Earths of horses, or 87 planet Earths of Chinese military personnel, or the land surface mass of 186,000 miles or 7.5 Earths, to put them on. And what makes him think he can arbitrarily demand the number 200 million be literal, but everything else in the text, such as its reference to horses, or that it is the size of the ground invasion force specifically, be all ignored as literal too simply because it's convenient to his interpretation. And by the way, the Euphrates River, which the text says they cross, is only 1,740 miles long. The physical size of an army of 200 million people would be bigger than the entire length of the Euphrates River. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 108 times over. You would need 108 Euphrates rivers for it to even be a logistical problem, in comparison to the land surface mass of the army itself. If you convert miles to feet by taking the length of the Euphrates River in miles, which is 1,740 miles, and multiplying it by the number of feet in a miles, which is 5,280 feet, you get 9,187,200 feet. If you take the number of people in a 200 million man army and divide it by the number of feet of the entire Euphrates River, you end up with 21 soldiers per foot of ground space. That's 21 people on every 1 square foot of land, along the entire distance of the Euphrates River. 21 people per square foot. Have you ever tried to get 21 people on 1 square foot? 1 square foot is less space than what a single human body would even occupy. In order to get a 200 million man army squeezed into the land space bordered by the Euphrates River, you would have to stack soldiers on top of one another 21 people high per foot of space. How high is 21 people per square foot? The average adult male height is 5 feet 10 inches. So if you multiply 5 feet 10 inches by 21, you will get 122.5 feet, or about 123 feet tall. How high is 123 feet? If you take the standard height of a story in a building as 10 feet, that means you would have to stack soldiers on top of one another, higher than a 12-story building. Here's a picture of a 12-story building. Next to it is a picture of 21 soldiers stacked on top of one another, 12 stories high. And the third picture is a picture of 21 soldiers stacked on top of each other, 12 stories high, per square foot. or in other words, a wall of human bodies 12 stories high, which would go for 1,740 miles long, or roughly the air distance miles from Washington, D.C., all the way to Salt Lake City, Utah. Does that sound like anything even remotely literal, or even realistic to you? Perhaps it does, if you believe there are zombie-producing locust bugs that live in the center of the Earth. But logistically, in terms of actually conducting a battle on a targeted military zone, it would be both a logistical disaster and a complete strategic nightmare, in terms of modern warfare. One conventional bomb drop would wipe out hundreds of thousands of soldiers at a time, even if you could actually pile them all up on top of each other's bodies like that. No military commander in his right mind would ever do that in modern warfare, even if it were possible. Which, for all logistical and practical purposes, it isn't. The average daily excrement produced by a healthy adult male is a little less than half a pound of waste. An army of 200 million soldiers would produce almost 100 million tons of excrement daily. Even the most basic support services for such a huge army, such as such simple things as sewage management, water and even food supplies, would become Herculean tasks to manage, just to keep the soldiers alive and healthy, and free of disease. The false and fictitious claims by counter-reformationists that this is the literal body count of a literal modern army, are complete fantasy and make-believe. And all you have to do to prove it, is simply do the math. They are not prophecies in Revelation chapter 9. These fictions are the counter-reformation's cover story of what they do know, was prophesied, and what actually happened in history, that they are now busy intentionally hiding from the public. In this video, you have seen how the counter-reformation lies about the actual Greek text, in Revelation chapter 9 verses 13 through 21, behind fraudulent claims and mistranslated words. How they hide the references to known historical fulfillments in these prophecies behind ridiculous false claims that the text says there are 4 river demons who will initiate the end of the world, when in fact, it is very clear from the Greek text, no such thing is stated. Neither in regard to demons, or even being in the river. And you have seen how they use the term brimstone to hide the known historical reference to sulfur used to make gunpowder, which was introduced to Europe precisely the way John described emerging in the early 1200s, against the Roman Byzantium army, in their plate armor, with their scorpion crossbows, and riding their barded horses, that looked like locusts. And you saw how they tried to hide the known reference to a Greek hyperbolic numerical expression used by John, by turning it into a ridiculous hyperliteralism, that is logistically, a numeric impossibility, requiring the addition quantities of dozens of more worlds of land space, Chinese soldiers, and horses, in order to actually fulfill. Rendering the entire claim of a 200 million man cavalry, or even a foot soldier army itself, factually, simply an incredulous lie, intended to victimize the naive. In the next video, we will take all the information you have learned from our topical studies on chapter 9, and exegete the entire chapter in one video, placing it on John's astronomically dated timeline, and showing its fulfillment in history. You will be both impressed and amazed at what John has really written, and you will see why the Counter-Reformation has worked so hard, and gone to such extremes to hide one of the most amazing stories in the history of the human race. Don't miss the next video. Thank you for watching.